Hello, my name is Heath Jones, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I usually use these moments at the beginning to tell you some more about who Northwood is, who we are, and how you can learn more about us. And I still want you to know all about that, so please check us out at www.indyncc.org. That's indncc.org. Or if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, or follow our podcast on whatever app that you use to listen. That's what I say basically at the beginning of every one of these episodes. But perhaps it's a safe assumption that if you are already here, then you know something, if not quite a lot, about me, Heath Jones, or about our church, Northwood Christian Church. And assuming this to be the case with some of you, I'd like to use this moment to make an almost impassioned plea, a request. Please share. Share our podcast with your friends and share on any or all social media platforms that you can. Or you can link it in a text message or whatever. The point is, get the word out there because this will help us get our word out. And who knows, you might be sending someone a message of hope for someone who needs to hear it, but you'll also be helping us grow. And so we would sure appreciate it if you would share, like, subscribe, all of those things to tell all of the algorithms in the digisphere on the internet that people like us, and maybe others might as well, send some people our way. That being said, let's pause right now for the ads our podcast audience will be listening to right here, and we'll be back shortly. And we're back, or probably you never left. Either way, our scripture passage for consideration today is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, and we will be reading verses 5 through 19, and they go. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you can see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." And they asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified. For these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. And there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and siblings, by relatives and friends. And they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." A few years ago, my wife and I took our children to see a Winter Light show at our art museum here in Indianapolis. We go every year. If you're in the area, you should check it out. It's an outside event. You walk through a forest of lit up trees and other light displays. And in the pinnacle moment, the grand finale, if you will, there's a light display on the front of a mansion, the Eli Lilly House, or the Lilly House as it is called, where the person who owns Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals used to live. It's part of the museum complex now, and they do this light display on it. It's very impressive, and my children, before you even go to this light display, love this house. And as for my eldest daughter, it's been a fixture in her life. We visited often, not just for winter light shows, but just around the calendar year, and it's become a place that we feel some sense of ownership of just because of how often we frequent it. Or we at least feel this strong connection with it because of the memories that we've made there, if for nothing else. Well, as I was saying, we're at the light show, and then there's the grand finale that occurs on the face of this house. And more accurately, the grand finale occurred on the Lily House as if it were a canvas. Picture it as a screen lit up with lights. And there's a light display, and spoiler alert here, it builds up to a moment, the pinnacle moment, the grand finale, as I was saying, when the Lily House appears to collapse in a heap of rubble before our eyes. But then it will soon appear to reassemble. But in that moment between its seeming collapse and reconstruction, our eldest daughter, who has been visiting this house since she was a very little girl, became unglued. She started to weep, in fact, weeping at the loss of something she loved. She fell apart as her beloved landmark fell to pieces because she felt as though part of herself was being destroyed in that moment. How much more so for those who saw the epicenter of their religious and communal life crumble? Which is what happened, and those times are what Jesus is talking about here in the passage we're reading, about the temple falling down. That's what it would have felt like. The story begins with an implied dialogue between some people in Jerusalem, and they're talking about how beautiful the temple is, and of course it was. Look at the jewels and the gems and the walls so perfectly cut. All of this for God, by the way, but for them, the people, it was far more than just a beautiful building. It was the epicenter, as I described it earlier, of their religious and communal life. So this is not just a pretty building. This is the heart of their culture in some ways. And it was a place where generation after generation, the faithful had traveled to celebrate high and holy festivals. So your great-grandfather and then his father would have gone to that place. And now it's you in that place looking on this beautiful edifice, this temple, the hub of all the activity going back generations. Now, it had been destroyed in the past, but each time it had been rebuilt. And this time it had been built on Herod the Great's dime, and he had resources. So the temple in Jesus' day was truly something to look at. The pride of the people, and also where the people find connection to God. And that had been true for a long time. And so Jesus looks at this edifice, this important construct, and says, yeah, that temple is going to come down. And not just come down. It will be, eventually was, completely dismantled. Unthinkable. For to destroy the temple is to cut the people off from the past, from the memories, from their ancestors. So for the temple to be destroyed is to destroy that place where the lives of the people have intersected with the lives of their ancestors, their grandparents, their great-grandparents. And more recently, the temple had been an island of stability in a world that had been thrown in every direction by Rome and the ruling class. And I think here we can relate. There are those sacred places that bind us to our past, our memories, to those who we love, and to those times when we had an encounter with God. And these places become extensions of us. And these days, in the year 2022, a lot of those places feel threatened. Yeah. What more can I say? When my grandmother, my mom's mom, died, another story, her children had to make a hard choice. You see, their mom had lived in the very house that they had each grown up in, her and her siblings, and they'd known it their entire lives, her and her brother and her sister. And I can remember it, that house, and the aspects of Grandma's house that had remained unchanged through the decades, growing up from age 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15. And it would occur to me at times when I was playing in that place or sleeping overnight at Grandma's house that I was in the very same rooms that my mother, my aunt, my uncle had slept in and played in. Indeed, I played with some of those same toys that my mother and her siblings had owned when they were young. So when my grandma died, the question became, what should we do with the house? Our soul in some ways. At least it touches our soul, our spirit, that physical, geographical space. In the end, they decided that they had to sell it. Of course they did. And so they did. And I'll never forget driving to my grandma's house with my mom for that final time. Just me and her. And she sent me out after we'd gone through, make sure everything was okay, lock it up for the realtor. She stayed in a bit longer, and I'll never forget the sound of her sobs, gut-wrenching cries that came from very deep within her, because her temple was coming down. She was losing a part of herself. And for the people of Israel in Jesus' day, the destruction of the temple, or even contemplating the destruction of that temple, would feel like the death of the national psyche, the defeat of God and goodness itself. And while this happened, because it did, it must have felt like nothing good was permanent. But here's the thing. Luke wrote this gospel that we were reading today about these terrible events 15 years after these events took place, about 15 years. And his original audience would have experienced these events, and they would have lived to tell the tale. So for them, these were not predictions about the future, but descriptions about the very recent past. So in that light, this text really isn't a prophecy, but rather an interpretation of events that have already happened. An interpretation that chooses to notice God at work through it all, sustaining the people and keeping the church together. Because the temple did come down in the year 70, as I said, but 15 years before Luke wrote his gospel, that means that the people there who were hearing this for the first time had lived it. But they had been through tumultuous times. Things had been bad up until that point, and things had continued to be bad. That war that would bring down the temple would last about half a decade, from the year 66 to 70 Common Era. Throughout much of that time, Jerusalem was under siege. All of this is in the psyche of the people hearing this, as Jesus is talking, but then also as Luke is penning his gospel. To help me describe all of this, I would like to employ the help of a Lutheran pastor named John Petty. And I know this is a longer quote, but I think it gets the job done to describe the vibe, the ethos around Jesus at the time and around the time of Luke's writing, the gospel that we just read. Quoting him, AD 69 was a very strange year. Within Jerusalem, the Jewish defenders were divided. In hopes of a ceasefire, some advocated for accommodation with the Romans. Some of the more fanatical Jewish defenders, on the other hand, took an apocalyptic view. If they could just hold on a while longer, they thought God would intervene and smite the offenders. These more fanatical defenders gained the upper hand in the city, and some believe they likely put pressure on the followers of Jesus, urging them to abandon nonviolence and join the struggle against the infidel Romans. Jerusalem put up a stout defense, and the Romans had a hard time subjugating the city. When they did, it wasn't pretty. They destroyed everything they could destroy. Blood ran in the streets. As an aside, here Reverend Petty cites an ancient Jewish historian named Josephus. You've probably heard of him, but here I am quoting John Petty, quoting Josephus. Quote, "The roar of the flames, streaming far and wide, mingling with the groans of the victims. One would have thought that the whole city was ablaze. With the cries on the hill were blended those of the multitude in the city below. And now many who were emaciated and tongue-tied from starvation, when they beheld the sanctuary on fire, gathered strength once more for lamentations and wailing. Yet more awful than the uproar were the sufferings." So that's the historian Josephus, who was living around the time of these events and could perhaps have talked to people first or second generation removed from these events. So that's the end of that quote. Going on with what John Petty has to say about this time in Jesus' context, in the context of the Gospel of Luke, quote, "The destruction of the temple was utterly devastating for the people. Some traditions associated with the temple, such as the Sadducees, were destroyed, never to rise again, which incidentally resulted in the rise of rabbinical, synagogue-based Judaism. So that last line about the Sadducees being destroyed, keep that in mind when you're reading these gospel stories. By the time these gospels were written down, the Sadducees didn't even exist anymore because of all the violence in the city. All of this to say, by the time Luke's readers would have had this gospel in hand, the events that Jesus foreshadowed in this gospel had already occurred. So imagine reading this from the vantage point of someone who has lived it. Somebody comes into town with Luke's gospel, brand new, hot off the presses, describing what you had been through. All of the would-be messiahs and hapless wannabe saviors mentioned in verse 8, they had already flamed out. So Jesus in Luke says, don't follow them. Wars and nations rising up against one another. Again, from the vantage point of Luke's original audience, he is merely describing the soundtrack to their lives, one that had seemingly been on loop for years. Jesus goes on to describe arrests and persecutions and the ways that things would get very hard. And it's highly likely that some of those in Luke's original audience would be nodding along to these descriptions of persecution, having endured these things themselves, thinking, he's describing me. That was me. And the persecution described in verse 13 and then verses 14 and 15 go on to suggest that even when the persecuted didn't have the opportunity to prepare a defense, it's okay. They found words in the moment, apparently. And here, Luke's audience may well have recalled stories when they or someone else in the community stood tall and spoke truth to power. Mic drop moments. Words that seemed so inspired in the moment that they must have come from above. Then, in verse 16, Jesus describes the ways that family members can turn on each other, even betray one another during tumultuous and hard times. Families divided, houses divided, and here members of Luke's original audience may have nodded, noticing the brothers and the sisters, cousins and friends who were not there, who had abandoned the cause, or who had caved into pressure and cooperated with Roman oppressors to make life still harder. Maybe those who weren't there were those who had lost their lives because of the betrayal of family members or friends. But even through this, quoting the tail end of verse 16, they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. That moment, after having heard that, Luke's readers and listeners might have let those last words linger for a moment. By our endurance, we will gain our souls. So imagine you're standing there and you're listening to this gospel being read, year 85 CE, 15 years after the temple has fallen, and a person standing beside you turns to you and says, and that is just what happened. We did keep our faith, and here we are. And we did keep our souls. We are here to tell the tale. They kept the faith, and they kept their hair on their heads. They endured, and they were able to, as the text puts it, gain their souls. And that's sort of an awkward way to say it. Gain your souls. Never heard it before. I studied the Greek language behind the sentence, and perhaps it would be helpful to think of it this way. Those who endure through all of this sort of stuff that we're describing find and keep their lives. And that word here translated as soul, or I translated it as lives, comes from the Greek word psyche, which describes the essence of who one is. This is your central self. We are talking about the central self that we are saving here. All of you, in fact. And those in Luke's original audience, 15 years removed from a national tragedy on par with any that you have ever heard of. They had not only survived, but they had not lost themselves. It's one thing to survive, but you can lose yourself in these kinds of moments in history. They had not colluded with Roman officials to save their skins. They had not betrayed their friends and family. And in the face of intense pressure, they had not partnered with local governing officials or religious rulers to line their pockets and to profit off the poor, as so many members of their community had. These are just a few of different ways of saying that they kept their souls themselves. They did not lose themselves when hard pressed or tempted and probably afraid. And they survived, to boot. And Luke's telling of Jesus' story was meant to help these early Christians come to terms with all of the suffering and the chaos around them that I have been describing, and also to help them to see that through it all, God had already sustained them. Even as temples fell, God was with the people redeeming and restoring, leading the people to new life. For those in Jesus' community, their worship would transition into smaller houses of worship called synagogues. And they discovered that even with the temple destroyed, God was still with them. They thought that when the temple was destroyed, all would be lost. The life of Israel would end. But the life of Israel did not end. Though the Jews were scattered, displaced, and persecuted, they time and time again cultivated pockets of life. By the way, a pattern that would continue through the centuries and millennia to come. This is what God's Spirit calls us towards and makes possible in difficult times. The temple may have been destroyed, but God's house was discovered to be in every place, even in the hearts of the people, even in humble living rooms, caves. They found places to be, and the people endured. Their lives were saved in the most important ways. This passage is also for those of us whose temples have already fallen, if they haven't fallen already. I've talked about some of the temples that have fallen in my life, my grandma's house. And here's what you need to know in 2022. As temples seem to crumble all around us in the form of worn down institutions and disillusionment, the disillusionment that many of us feel in relation to some alleged American dream. When my mom left her childhood home, she returned to the home that she was creating then with my dad. I was a kid at the time, and it's a safe place. I remember it as a safe place for her children and eventually her grandchildren, my kids. And when I have to sell that home that I grew up in, there will be something else after the searing loss. The time will come, but there will be something else. When the disciples lost their Messiah, Jesus, they found that there was even life after the most tragic of deaths for them. The resurrection of Jesus points us towards life after every end. Life that is endless, with many surprising and astounding rebirths. Salvation comes in many forms, and again and again. Our church, Northwood Christian Church, has been a church that has mourned loss after loss in every possible sense. Temples do fall. Many of our temples, or parts of our temple, have fallen. Things have changed. As leaves fall on the ground and then feeds the soil, our ministries and efforts at church, they change too. And some old ideas are left behind and feed the future. And our brothers and sisters die and leave gaps in our lives. We've had a lot of funerals lately at Northwood. And we can, along with Luke's audience, expect to experience hard times to come. But we can remember hard times in the past, can't we? And those of you who are still here have endured. And you have not been overwhelmed as of yet by the times that we are living in. You might be this close, but you haven't caved yet. So hold on. That's part of the point. Maybe the most important point here. Hold on. You can make it through this with your soul intact, without losing yourself in this rat race. But, truth be told, our temples have fallen, some of them. And this is tragic. This is heartbreaking, but it's also okay. We always knew that it would be hard and that times would change. And Jesus has told this to his disciples for thousands of years, that temples fall, have fallen, will continue to fall. And all that we know will change, but the church of God remains. The body of Christ will rise again and again and again in different forms. And through it all, you will remain. We remain. When temples fall, well, let them fall. What remains are the communities called together by God. The community hearing Luke's gospel read for the first time would have been keenly aware of what they had been through. And those of us who have answered the call will face struggles, but the struggle itself will shape us. And through the holding on, God will uncover for us our truest and best selves. We will save our souls. Keep our souls. Hold on to what matters. God will uncover for us our truest and best selves. So I guess all this to say, come what may, buckle up.